The Last Letter from Leningrad, January 20th, 1943. The photograph is brittle now, faded around the edges, creased by time. In it, a young Soviet girl, no older than 12, stands on a snow-covered street in the ruins of Leningrad. Behind her, a row of burnt-out trolley cars lie frozen in place, their windows shattered like the nerves of the city. She clutches a folded piece of paper tightly to her chest. Her face is pale, not just from the cold, but from hunger and exhaustion. Her eyes, wide and hollow, stare directly into the lens. It was taken on January 20th, 1943, by a frontline war correspondent embedded with Red Army relief teams who had entered newly reclaimed districts of the city. The siege had not yet ended, but that day marked a turning point. A narrow land corridor had finally been opened. Trains could move again. Supplies could trickle in. For the first time in almost 900 days, the city could breathe, just barely. The girl's name was never recorded. But what she carried was later found, the letter. Handwritten, addressed to Papa at the front, and dated the same day. It would become one of the last personal documents recovered from the siege zone before the city began its long road to survival. This documentary tells the story of that letter, not just as a note from a daughter to her father, but as a symbol of endurance, starvation, sacrifice, and survival inside one of history's longest and deadliest sieges. Leningrad had endured 2 winters without food, electricity, or warmth. Over 1 million civilians were dead. And yet, even in that moment, the child had written. And someone had taught her that words, like people, were worth saving. Leningrad, formerly known as St. Petersburg, stood as one of the most symbolic and strategically vital cities of the Soviet Union. With its deep historical roots as the imperial capital of Russia and its proximity to the Finnish border and Baltic Sea, Leningrad represented not only military importance but also cultural and ideological pride. By 1941, it was home to over 3 million civilians. When Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, the Nazi war machine rolled eastward toward the Soviet Union in the largest land invasion in human history. Army Group North, under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, had one primary objective: to encircle and eliminate Leningrad. The German plan was not to occupy the city through conventional urban combat but to destroy it through isolation and starvation. Hitler made it clear in his orders, Leningrad was to be wiped off the map. Civilians would not be evacuated. No surrender would be accepted. The city was to be encircled, shelled, and left to die in silence. By September 8, 1941, German forces had completed the encirclement of Leningrad from the south and west, while Finland blocked escape to the north. The only tenuous connection to the rest of the Soviet Union was across Lake Ladoga, a route that would soon become infamous as the Road of Life. Within the siege perimeter were more than 2.5 million civilians, including 400,000 children. Trapped with them were remnants of the Red Army, factory workers, nurses, students, and the elderly. The first winter of the siege, 1941–42, became a humanitarian catastrophe. Fuel disappeared. Electricity failed. Water froze in the pipes. Public transportation stopped. Rations were reduced to 125 grams of bread per person per day, and even that bread was stretched with sawdust, cellulose, or floor sweepings. Hunger reduced people to their most desperate instincts. Pets vanished. Wallpaper glue was boiled to make broth. Entire families died in their homes, unable to move, speak, or seek help. In some apartments, bodies were stacked in corners, preserved by the extreme cold. Many survivors later spoke of the silence that consumed the city. There were no birds, no dogs barking, no children playing. Just the wind and the distant rumble of artillery. Despite this, Leningrad did not surrender. It became a symbol of Soviet resistance. Even as factories lost power, workers continued to build tanks and ammunition by candlelight. The Kirov plant, one of the city's largest arms factories, operated under bombardment conditions, with many workers sleeping on the production floor. Schools relocated into basements and tunnels. Hospitals overflowed. Death rate soared. In January 1942 alone, more than 100,000 people died from starvation and cold. But the Soviet Union would not abandon the city. Relief efforts through Lake Ladoga began when the ice thickened. Trucks, known as Studebakers, drove across the frozen surface carrying flour, sugar, and oil. The same route carried out thousands of children and the wounded. This fragile lifeline was constantly shelled by the Germans, but it kept part of the city alive. In early 1943, after over 16 months of siege, Soviet forces prepared a counteroffensive. The goal was to break the blockade and reconnect Leningrad to the rest of the country. On January 12, 1943, the Red Army launched Operation Iskra, meaning spark, a joint assault by the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts. Soviet artillery opened with a massive bombardment, followed by infantry and tank advances in the swamps and forests near the southern shore of Lake Ladoga. The terrain was brutal. Temperatures were below freezing. German defenses were layered and reinforced. Yet, the Soviets pushed forward relentlessly. After 6 days of fierce fighting, Soviet troops broke through German lines and linked up behind enemy positions. By January 18, 1943, a narrow corridor had been established between Leningrad and the rest of the Soviet Union. On January 20, just 2 days later, supply convoys began moving through a newly constructed railway line, bringing in food, medicine, and fuel. It was the first time in nearly 500 days that the city had received aid by land. Though the siege was not fully lifted until January 1944, this breach marked a turning point. That same day, Soviet war correspondents and relief teams entered sections of the city that had been isolated for over a year. What they found was unimaginable. Entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. Streets filled with ice and corpses. Apartment blocks where everyone had died. Children too weak to cry. One of those correspondents captured a now iconic photograph of a young girl standing alone in the snow. Her clothes were torn. Her shoes were mismatched. She held a small folded letter to her chest. Her name was not recorded. But the letter she carried would later be found among personal effects collected in the Kalinin district, one of the hardest-hit working-class neighborhoods along the Neva River. The envelope read simply, "To Papa, Red Army, Southern Front." The letter itself was only a few lines long, handwritten in pencil. Though damaged by moisture, its contents were partially legible. It mentioned hunger, the cold, and a promise to stay brave. It closed with the words, "Please come back. Mama is gone. I wait for you." Historians believe the letter was written that very day, January 20, 1943. During the siege, handwritten letters became sacred objects. Postal services inside Leningrad had all but collapsed, but people continued to write. Some letters were never sent. Others were delivered by hand across frozen streets, often by children. These documents, many of which were later archived by Soviet war museums, offer rare insight into civilian life during the siege. The letter carried by the girl was preserved and added to a wartime archive managed by the Museum of the Defense of Leningrad. It remains one of the few physical documents linking the exact date of January 20, 1943, to a named military operation, a specific neighborhood, and the experience of a child survivor. The Kalinin district, where the letter was found, was a densely populated industrial zone before the war. Many residents worked in shipyards and armament factories. During the siege, this district was shelled relentlessly. Civilians lived in cramped communal apartments, often without heat or light. One historian noted that by the end of the first siege winter, only a fraction of the population remained. The rest had either died or been evacuated. When Soviet teams entered the area in January 1943, they documented scenes of total collapse, a classroom filled with frozen desks, a hospital ward where no one had survived, stairwells with messages scrawled in charcoal on the walls. Among these ruins stood the girl, alive but barely. And in her hands, a letter. That small act of writing, of trying to reach her father, became a symbol of the resilience of Leningrad's children. It demonstrated that even in the face of annihilation, the instinct to communicate, to remember, and to hope had not been extinguished. This documentary uses the date of January 20, 1943, and the recovered letter as a lens through which to understand the broader civilian experience during the Siege of Leningrad. It is not a story of generals or battle plans, but of endurance, starvation, memory, and the human cost of one of the most brutal campaigns in the Second World War. In a city of silence, that letter still speaks. The letter recovered on January 20, 1943, is a fragile document preserved on a torn piece of notebook paper, roughly 12 by 18 centimeters in size. The handwriting is uneven, slanted, and faint in parts, likely written with a soft pencil or a burnt matchstick. While parts of the message are smudged due to moisture and exposure, the legible portion has been studied and translated multiple times by Soviet-era archivists and later by international scholars. It begins simply, "Dear Papa, if you get this letter, please know that I am still alive. Mama is not. She stopped waking up 6 days ago. I put a blanket over her. I did not know what else to do. We have no bread since Tuesday. I went outside yesterday to see if the school was open. It is not. There were only dogs. I am not scared of the bombs anymore. I sleep near the oven with my coat on. I hope you are warm where you are. I am trying to be brave. Love, your daughter." This message, believed to have been written by a girl aged around 10 or 11, remains one of the most poignant surviving civilian accounts from inside the siege. It does not describe strategy, battles, or politics. It does not include dates or locations. But in a few broken sentences, it captures the essence of what the siege was for millions: loneliness, hunger, loss, and an unshaken hope that someone might still be listening. The child's name is not known. There was no signature. Soviet War Archives listed only as a letter number 14, Kalinin District, January 1943. The absence of her name has made this story emblematic of all children of the siege. Soviet authorities collected tens of thousands of letters, diaries, and personal items in the aftermath of each major wartime operation. These documents were stored in state archives, many of which were eventually transferred to the Central State Archive of Literature and Art in Leningrad. A special collection was created in the late 1940s titled The Siege of Leningrad: Personal Testimonies. It is from this collection that letter number 14 was publicly released in the 1960s during a national memorial campaign. The letter was published in a Soviet magazine, accompanied by the original photograph of the girl standing in the snow. The photo, taken by military photographer Anatoly Arkhipov, had remained unpublished until then. His notes describe the girl as small, underweight, dressed in a patched coat and boots several sizes too large. She was standing outside what used to be a neighborhood school, now reduced to rubble. Arkhipov had been attached to the 67th Army Press Unit, covering the reopening of civilian areas following Operation Iskra. In his notebook, he simply wrote, "Girl with letter. Refused to leave. Waiting for her father." The image, when published, drew national attention. It was printed in newspapers, featured in exhibitions, and referenced in memorial speeches. Over time, it became one of the unofficial symbols of the siege, a representation of all unnamed children who suffered and endured. The impact of the letter extended beyond the Soviet Union. In the 1980s, during a period of increased cultural exchange between the USSR and Western nations, a collection of siege letters was translated into English, French, and German. Letter number 14 was among them. Western audiences, often familiar with the military aspects of the Eastern Front but less so with its civilian cost, responded with shock to the letter's quiet desperation. The document was cited in multiple academic studies and humanitarian exhibitions. In 1993, on the 50th anniversary of the breach of the siege, the letter was displayed at the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg in a special exhibition titled 872 Days, Leningrad's Memory. A printed copy of the letter was placed in a glass case, beside the photograph and a pair of children's boots recovered from the same district. That exhibition drew over 500,000 visitors in 4 months. The symbolic value of the letter lies not only in its contents but in its timing. January 20, 1943, was not just another day of suffering. It was the first day of renewed contact with the outside world. Soviet convoys had begun moving along the newly constructed Shlisselburg-Sinyavino rail line, bringing the first large-scale deliveries of food and medicine into the city in over a year. Relief workers fanned out through devastated neighborhoods. The fact that the letter was found that day reinforces its historical and emotional weight. It marked the line between total isolation and the slow beginning of reconnection. Analysts studying the letter have pointed to the girl's reference to the absence of fear. "I am not scared of the bombs anymore." This line has been quoted extensively in psychological studies of siege trauma. After prolonged periods of starvation, cold, and death, fear itself often became numbed. Survivors from Leningrad have repeatedly stated that they no longer registered the sound of shelling by late 1942. Hunger and cold were far more immediate threats. The letter also makes mention of her mother's death, described with chilling simplicity, and Mama is not. "She stopped waking up 6 days ago. I put a blanket over her." This type of civilian death, quiet, undramatic, unseen, was common during the siege. Most people died not from explosions but from hunger in their own homes. One of the most difficult tasks for post-liberation recovery teams was documenting the sheer volume of home deaths. Many bodies were only discovered weeks or months later. In some cases, surviving family members continued to live in the same room, unable or unwilling to leave. The girl's note closes with the sentence, "I hope you are warm where you are. I am trying to be brave." The idea of bravery, even in extreme vulnerability, became a theme in Soviet wartime culture. Propaganda often emphasized heroic resistance, but letters like this one reveal a quieter kind of heroism, that of a child choosing to write instead of giving in to silence. The father she addressed was never found. Archival search efforts cross-referenced military rosters from the Southern Front, which included areas near Stalingrad and Rostov. Several soldiers with common surnames were considered, but no definitive match was made. The child may have written the letter with no means to send it, and no realistic hope it would be read. Yet, she wrote it anyway. That decision, in itself, speaks volumes about the endurance of hope. In 2010, Russian historian Elena Krivtsova published a book compiling civilian letters from the siege. Letter number 14 was featured on the cover, with an entire chapter dedicated to its context and preservation. She described it as the most honest document of Leningrad's pain, because it has no enemy, no blame, only longing. Krivtsova noted that the letter contains no reference to Germans, war crimes, or even the word war itself. It is a purely internal reflection, focused on absence, survival, and emotional attachment. In this way, it offers a unique civilian voice within a historical narrative often dominated by military detail. Today, The letter is stored in the State Memorial Museum of the Defense and Siege of Leningrad. It has been digitized and included in school curriculums across Russia. Teachers use it to explain the human cost of war, especially to younger students. Survivors who read it at public events often do so with visible emotion, even decades after the war's end. The photo of the girl remains unverified, but its authenticity has never been challenged. Even if it did not capture the exact moment the letter was written, it captured the truth of the moment. A single child, alive amid a city of the dead, clutching a message that was never meant for history, only for a father who might never return. The power of the letter lies in what it represents, not just loss, but persistence. Not just starvation, but speech. It shows that in a city reduced to silence, there were still voices. In a place surrounded by death, someone still wrote words of love and hope. This documentary does not attempt to create myths. It presents facts, documents, and verified photographs. But within those cold materials are fragments of something more, evidence of a human spirit that refused to disappear. The letter from Leningrad is one such fragment. And it endures. The turning point in the story of Leningrad, and in the story of the letter, arrived in mid-January 1943 with the Soviet launch of Operation Iskra. For 16 months, the city had remained isolated, surrounded on all sides by German and Finnish forces, with no access to land-based resupply routes. Only the dangerous ice convoys across Lake Ladoga, limited in capacity and exposed to German shelling, had sustained the population at a bare minimum. Civilian death rates had reached catastrophic levels. By late 1942, entire neighborhoods had ceased to function. Families froze in their apartments. Hospitals operated without light, heat, or anesthesia. The psychological collapse was as profound as the physical one. Soviet High Command, determined to break the encirclement, formulated Operation Iskra as a coordinated assault between the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts, designed to pierce the German lines near the southern shore of Lake Ladoga. The operation was launched on January 12, 1943, following an intense preparatory artillery barrage. The offensive was brutal. Soviet soldiers advanced in deep snow, over mined terrain, under constant fire. German defenders, fortified in bunkers and trenches, resisted with heavy machine guns and artillery. But Soviet forces moved steadily, inch by inch, through the forests and marshes east of Schlisselburg. On January 18, the assaulting troops of both fronts met near Workers' Settlement No. 1, successfully cutting through the German blockade. A land corridor approximately 10 kilometers wide was opened. Though narrow and still under enemy artillery range, it was sufficient to lay down rail lines and establish consistent vehicular access. This breakthrough did not lift the siege entirely, but it changed everything. For the first time since September 1941, the Soviet Union could deliver large-scale supplies into Leningrad by land. Medical personnel, engineers, journalists, and recovery teams began entering the city through the new corridor. On January 20, just 2 days after the corridor was secured, the first convoys began arriving. Trucks carrying flour, meat, medicine, and fuel crossed into Leningrad's eastern sectors. Among the first to arrive were military photographers and correspondents assigned to document the conditions of the civilian population. One of them was Anatoly Arkhipov, whose image of the girl with the letter would later become the most recognized civilian photograph of the siege. His assignment was clear: document the human consequences of starvation, isolation, and war for the historical record. Arkhipov was accompanied by members of the 67th Army's political department and a Red Cross evaluation team. They entered the Kalinin district, a densely populated area that had suffered heavy artillery bombardment in 1942 and early 1943. Most of the buildings were heavily damaged. Streets were covered in ice, rubble, and debris. The population was severely reduced. Many homes were abandoned or occupied by a single survivor. In one building, they found a group of elderly women wrapped in curtains and newspaper for warmth. In another, an entire family had perished together. They had not been moved. It was in this environment that the girl was encountered. She was alone, standing near the entrance of what had once been a school building. Arkhipov noted that she did not run or hide when the soldiers approached. She did not smile. She simply looked at them and continued holding the folded paper. When asked where her family was, she reportedly said, "They are gone. I am waiting for Papa." The Red Cross team offered her food and blankets. A medic examined her and determined she was severely malnourished but not beyond recovery. The girl refused to leave the spot until the soldiers agreed to deliver her letter. Arkhipov took her photo and wrote in his field journal that she insisted the letter be kept safe. A member of the team took the paper and placed it in a document pouch. The girl was then taken to a temporary aid station set up in a surviving building nearby. She was recorded as an unidentified minor, and her real name was never documented. Soviet military logistics teams began distributing food from the Victory Line Railway, which had been completed with extraordinary speed. Laid down in only 2 weeks, this temporary rail connection allowed daily convoys to bring in up to 800 tons of supplies. Bread rations were increased. Hospitals received bandages, antibiotics, and heating units. Relief workers collected the names of surviving children for future evacuation. However, in many areas, it was already too late. Soviet teams discovered blocks where the only living people were those too weak to move. The arrival of supplies on January 20 did not instantly end suffering, but it marked the beginning of a slow reversal. In that context, the girl's letter became symbolic. It was written at the precise intersection of survival and loss, of death and relief. The timing was critical. Had she written it a week earlier, it might have remained hidden and decayed. Had she waited longer, she might not have survived. In one recovered Soviet broadcast transcript from that day, a radio announcer said, "Today, the sun rose over Leningrad not in silence, but with the sound of arriving trucks. For the first time, the city hears the footsteps of help." This moment, January 20th, represents the climax of this story. The letter, found and preserved that same day, became a document of witness. It encapsulated not only a personal tragedy but also a collective moment in which the city, on the verge of collapse, began to rise again. Operation Iskra would continue in the days ahead, with Soviet forces expanding the corridor and securing its flanks. German counterattacks failed to retake the breach. By February, the city was receiving regular shipments. Civilians who had survived the worst winter now had a future to fight for. Many historians argue that without the success of Operation Iskra, the death toll in Leningrad could have doubled by the end of 1943. The girl's photo, when later circulated, was used in official publications to mark the symbolic shift from death to recovery. Her letter was not unique in content. Many siege letters contained similar expressions of loss, hunger, and hope, but its timing and preservation made it powerful. Soviet propaganda officials saw its potential. A copy of the letter was reprinted in Izvestia newspaper in April 1943, under the title "From a Child to the Front." It was accompanied by a call for greater food donations and military recruitment. The letter's reproduction was used to encourage both compassion and vigilance. It framed the civilian struggle not as passive suffering but as quiet resistance. The identity of the father was never confirmed. Records of Red Army personnel on the Southern Front in early 1943 are incomplete. Tens of thousands of soldiers were killed during the battles of Stalingrad and the Caucasus Campaign. It is possible that he never saw the letter, never even knew it existed. But the message, preserved and published, reached others. Survivors who read it in 1943 recalled weeping openly. In the years following the war, the letter became a regular feature in memorial exhibitions. It was cited in speeches, displayed on Victory Day, and included in school textbooks. The image of the girl holding the letter, small, silent, surrounded by ruin, came to define the human cost of the siege in a way that no statistic could. The climax of this story is not a battle, not a military victory, but the recovery of a single message written by a child who had lost everything and still believed it was worth writing. That moment, preserved on film and paper, reminds us that history is not only made by generals and armies, but by those who endure, write, and wait. The immediate aftermath of January 20, 1943, marked a shift in the survival trajectory of the city of Leningrad. Though the siege would not be fully lifted for another full year, the narrow corridor opened by Operation Iskra allowed for sustained logistical relief. Over the following weeks, more than 30,000 tons of food and supplies entered the city. Ration levels were slowly increased. Bread portions doubled by the end of February. For many civilians, this was the first time in over a year that they felt their survival was no longer purely a matter of chance. The temporary rail line known as the Victory Road continued operating around the clock despite ongoing German shelling. Emergency repairs were made daily. Engineers worked through freezing temperatures to keep the line functional. It was a fragile but vital artery that allowed Leningrad to stay alive. Civilian medical conditions remained dire. Thousands required emergency care for malnutrition-related disorders, frostbite, and untreated wounds. Makeshift hospitals expanded into schools, theaters, and churches. Red Army doctors arriving from the interior provided the first real medical assistance many had seen in months. By March 1943, coordinated child evacuations began again. Special trains were assigned to move orphans and vulnerable children from the city to the Volga region and beyond. These were often children who had survived the siege alone, like the girl found in the Kalinin district. Records show that by late spring, over 40,000 children were relocated through these convoys. Many were never reunited with surviving family members. The identity of the girl in the photograph remains officially unconfirmed. After her photograph was taken and the letter recovered, she was registered as an unidentified minor and transported to a temporary shelter in eastern Leningrad. From there, she was likely evacuated with other unaccompanied children during March or April. Her trail disappears in the mass movement of civilians. Despite extensive archival searches conducted in later decades, including during the 50th and 75th anniversaries of the siege, no one has been definitively matched to her identity. Soviet officials were often inconsistent in wartime record-keeping, especially when dealing with orphans or individuals lacking documents. Her image and letter became symbolic of all siege children, and in some ways, that anonymity only increased the power of her story. As spring approached, the psychological state of the population began to stabilize. While death and destruction remained, there was now a clear path toward recovery. Civil authorities resumed ration documentation, rebuilding efforts, and basic civil registry work. Some factories resumed limited operation. Cultural institutions, such as the Leningrad Philharmonic, began preparing public performances again. In May 1943, a commemorative event was held in the city's central district. Survivors gathered to mark the breach of the blockade and to honor the dead. Photographs from that day show hundreds of civilians, many wearing donated Red Army coats and boots, standing in silence. Wreaths were laid. Names were read aloud. That ceremony would become an annual tradition, still held in St. Petersburg today. The girl's letter was read aloud during the first of these memorials. A young actress recited it before a crowd of survivors and military officials. The scene was broadcast on Soviet radio, and the text was printed in newspapers across the country. It was not a speech about victory, revenge, or ideology. It was a message of survival, loss, and love, written by a child. In later decades, the Soviet state began organizing a systematic effort to preserve and document the cultural memory of the siege. Museums were established. Monuments were erected. Survivor testimonies were recorded. The letter became part of this national memory. It was printed in textbooks, displayed in traveling exhibitions, and quoted in state documentaries. For generations of Soviet and later Russian citizens, the story of the girl and her letter served as an accessible entry point into the vast and complex tragedy of Leningrad siege. Scholars, historians, and archivists would later analyze the language of the letter, its lack of ideological content, and its intimate voice. They noted its universal human message. It was not political. It did not blame. It simply described. In doing so, it carried the full emotional weight of civilian experience. Today, the letter is stored at the State Memorial Museum of the Defense and Siege of Leningrad. It remains one of the museum's most requested artifacts for viewing. It has been translated into over 20 languages and featured in exhibits across Europe and Asia. In 2023, on the 80th anniversary of Operation Iskra, the Russian Federation issued a commemorative stamp depicting the image of the girl holding her letter. The stamp included a caption that read, "She wrote. We remember." In the broader aftermath of the siege, Leningrad would rebuild slowly. The city remained under partial threat until January 1944, when the full German blockade was lifted by a new Soviet offensive. By that time, over 1.1 million civilians had died. Mass graves ringed the city. Survivors bore the lifelong scars of trauma, both physical and emotional. The recovery of a single letter on January 20, 1943, did not change the course of the war, but it preserved a moment of humanity that would otherwise have vanished. In that sense, its aftermath lives not in the statistics, but in the continued remembrance. The story of the letter from Leningrad is not extraordinary because of military heroism, technological innovation, or strategic brilliance. It is extraordinary because it survived. In the context of the Second World War, where entire cities were wiped from maps and millions perished without a trace, the survival of one child's handwritten message stands as a quiet but enduring act of defiance. It defied silence. It defied disappearance. It defied the erasure that war so often brings. What makes the letter powerful is its simplicity. It does not attempt to explain the war. It does not condemn the enemy. It does not seek sympathy. It simply tells the truth as a child saw it. A mother who had stopped waking up. A school that no longer opened. A child who was not afraid of bombs anymore. These were not metaphors. They were realities. The decision to write a letter in such a moment, without certainty that it could be sent or read, is evidence of something greater than survival. It is evidence of belief. Belief that the world beyond the siege still existed. Belief that someone, somewhere, might care. Belief that a father might return. In the decades since its discovery, the letter has been read by millions. It has outlived the regime under which it was written. It has outlived the generation who lived through the siege. It continues to be read in classrooms, museums, and memorials, often by children the same age as the girl who wrote it. It asks for nothing. It demands no revenge. It offers no resolution. But in its quiet lines, it gives something rare in the history of war, an unfiltered glimpse into the human soul at its most fragile and most determined. Leningrad endured 872 days of siege. It endured starvation, bombardment, isolation, and grief on a scale few cities have ever known. And in the heart of that destruction, someone still wrote. Today, we remember not because the letter was famous, but because it was real. It was not written for history. It became history. And that is why it must never be forgotten.